War teaches you something about yourself that nothing else can. It strips away every illusion, every comfortable lie you tell yourself about courage, about sacrifice, about what human beings are truly capable of when pushed beyond their limits. Winston Churchill thought he understood this. By 1944, he had witnessed 2 world wars, commanded armies, made decisions that sent hundreds of thousands to their deaths. He had seen the beaches of Gallipoli stained red, watched London burn under the Blitz, negotiated with tyrants and heroes alike. Churchill believed he had seen everything war could show a man. He was wrong. October 1944. The port of Antwerp had fallen into Allied hands nearly intact, a miracle in itself. The second largest port in Europe, capable of handling 40,000 tons of supplies daily, sitting there like a gift from God. The Allied advance had outrun its supply lines. Tanks sat immobile for lack of fuel. Artillery pieces fell silent for want of shells. Soldiers went hungry while mountains of food rotted in Normandy, too far away to matter. Antwerp could solve everything. Antwerp could win the war. There was just one problem. The Scheldt Estuary. 60 miles of the most nightmarish terrain Western Europe had to offer, still firmly in German hands. Without controlling the Scheldt, Antwerp was useless. Not a single supply ship could reach the port. And Hitler knew it. He ordered the Scheldt held at all costs, transformed into a killing ground so terrible that the Allies would bleed themselves white trying to take it. The Germans flooded the polders, turning the flat Dutch landscape into a maze of islands, canals, and mudflats. They fortified every farmhouse, every dike, every inch of high ground. They planted thousands of mines in fields that disappeared underwater. They positioned their artillery with interlocking fields of fire that left no safe approach. They dug in the 15th Army, battle-hardened veterans who had been fighting since 1939, men who knew that losing the Scheldt meant losing the war. And then they waited. The British tried first. The 52nd Lowland Division pushed into the flooded polders south of the Scheldt. Within hours they were drowning in freezing water and German fire. Men disappeared into canals, weighted down by equipment. Others drowned in shell craters they couldn't see beneath the murky water. The attack stalled. Then it collapsed. Montgomery needed someone else. Someone who could do the impossible. He called on the Canadians. The 1st Canadian Army had already been fighting for months, bleeding its way through France and Belgium. They were exhausted. They were under strength. Many of their units were down to 60% combat effectiveness. They had lost thousands in the battle for the Channel ports. And now Montgomery was asking them to assault the most heavily defended position in Western Europe, across terrain that made conventional military operations nearly impossible. General Guy Simons looked at his orders and understood what was being asked. This wasn't a battle. It was a sentence of death for thousands of his men. But it had to be done. Without Antwerp, the war would drag on through another winter. Without Antwerp, thousands more would die in a prolonged campaign. The math was brutal and simple. Sacrifice these men now or sacrifice even more later. On October 2, 1944, the Canadians began their advance into hell. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division drew the worst assignment, the Breskens Pocket, a fortified zone on the southern bank of the Scheldt where 15,000 German troops had been ordered to fight to the last man. The pocket was surrounded by water on 3 sides. The only approach was across flooded polders where the water reached chest height. Every step forward meant wading through freezing water while German machine guns fired from fortified positions on the dikes. German artillery, pre-sighted on every possible approach route, turned the water into a cauldron of high explosive and shrapnel. The Black Watch of Canada led the first assault. They waded forward in the pre-dawn darkness, moving as silently as possible through water that seemed to suck the warmth from their bodies with every step. The cold was paralyzing. Men lost feeling in their legs but kept moving forward because stopping meant dying. They held their rifles above their heads, hoping the weapons would still function when they needed them. Then the Germans opened fire. Tracer rounds lit up the darkness like deadly fireworks. Machine gun fire churned the water into foam. Men screamed and disappeared beneath the surface, pulled down by their equipment. Others tried to take cover in water too shallow to hide them. The Black Watch kept advancing because there was nowhere to retreat to. They reached the first dike and scrambled up, clawing at the muddy slope while bullets snapped past their heads. Private James Richardson was 19 years old. He had lied about his age to enlist, desperate to do his part before the war ended. Now he found himself pinned on a dike, unable to move forward or back, watching his friends die around him. A German machine gun nest 30 yards away had perfect fields of fire. Every time someone tried to move, the gun cut them down. Richardson saw his platoon sergeant take 3 rounds to the chest. Saw his best friend since training catch a burst that nearly tore him in half. Saw boys he had shared cigarettes with that morning floating face down in the water. Something broke inside him. Or maybe something crystallized. He stood up, exposed himself completely to enemy fire and charged. He made it 10 yards before the bullets found him. But those 10 yards gave his squad the opening they needed. While the German gunners focused on Richardson, 3 other men flanked the position and eliminated it with grenades. The advance continued. Richardson died face down in the mud, but his platoon survived. That was October 6th. The battle for the Breskens pocket would continue for another 3 weeks. The Canadians had to develop entirely new tactics. Conventional infantry operations didn't work in flooded terrain. They began using tracked amphibious vehicles called buffaloes, which could carry troops across the water and up onto the dikes. But the buffaloes were slow, lumbering targets. German anti-tank guns destroyed them by the dozens. The men inside either drowned when the vehicles sank or burned to death when ammunition cooked off. Artillery support was nearly impossible. The soft, waterlogged ground caused shells to bury themselves deep before exploding, reducing their effectiveness. Smoke shells, used to mask infantry advances, often failed to produce adequate coverage because of the constant wind across the flat landscape. The Canadians adapted. They learned to time their attacks for dawn and dusk, when the low angle of the sun blinded German observers. They learned to move in small groups, infiltrating through the network of canals rather than making frontal assaults across open water. But adaptation came at a terrible price. Every lesson was written in blood. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry found themselves fighting for a cluster of farmhouses that the Germans had transformed into miniature fortresses. The buildings sat on a dike, giving them commanding views of the surrounding flooded fields. German snipers in the upper floors could pick off anyone who approached. The Canadian artillery pounded the position for hours, reducing the buildings to rubble. Then the infantry went forward. The Germans were still there, dug into cellars beneath the destroyed buildings, waiting. As the Canadians approached, they emerged from underground and opened fire at point-blank range. The fight devolved into close-quarters combat with grenades, bayonets, and entrenching tools. Men fought room to room, cellar to cellar, sometimes hand-to-hand in the darkness. The battle for those farmhouses lasted 6 hours. When it ended, both sides had suffered nearly 100% casualties. The Canadians held the position but barely. Sergeant Tommy Prince, a First Nations soldier from Manitoba, became legendary during the Scheldt campaign. Prince was a scout and sniper, operating behind German lines to gather intelligence and eliminate high-value targets. He would disappear into no man's land for days at a time, moving through terrain that seemed impossible to traverse, appearing out of nowhere to take out German officers and machine gun crews. One night, Prince infiltrated a German command post located in a farmhouse 3 miles behind enemy lines. He spent 12 hours observing their communications and movements, memorizing their defensive positions and strength estimates. Then he crawled back through flooded fields and German patrols to deliver his intelligence to Canadian commanders. The information he provided allowed the Canadians to identify weak points in the German line and concentrate their attacks where they would be most effective. Prince's commanding officer recommended him for the Victoria Cross. The recommendation was denied because Army regulations stated that acts of valor had to be witnessed by a British officer. Prince didn't care about the medal. He cared about his brothers in arms surviving the battle. He went back behind German lines the next night. The fighting in the Breskens pocket continued without pause. The Germans counterattacked repeatedly, trying to drive the Canadians back into the water. Some of these counterattacks succeeded temporarily, retaking positions the Canadians had paid for in blood. But the Canadians always came back. They would regroup, reorganize, and attack again, grinding forward yard by yard. The German defenders began to crack. Supplies ran low. Ammunition ran out. Casualties mounted beyond the ability of their medical services to handle. But Hitler's orders were absolute: hold the Scheldt at all costs. So they held. They fought with diminishing ammunition and growing desperation, knowing they were trapped, knowing relief wasn't coming, fighting anyway because surrender meant prison camps or worse. By October 21st, the Canadians had compressed the Breskens pocket into an area barely 3 miles across. The Germans were trapped against the sea with nowhere to retreat. Some tried to escape by boat, crossing the Scheldt under cover of darkness. Canadian artillery and machine guns turned the water into a killing field. Bodies floated downstream for days. The final assault on the Breskens pocket began on October 22nd. The Canadians attacked from 3 directions simultaneously, using every weapon they had. The remaining German defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they were doomed. Farmhouses changed hands multiple times. Dikes became killing grounds where bodies piled so high that attacking troops had to climb over their own dead to continue the advance. On October 26, the last German positions in the Breskens pocket collapsed. Over 12,000 Germans surrendered. The Canadians had lost nearly 3,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. 3,000 casualties to advance 10 miles through flooded farmland. But the southern bank of the Scheldt was finally clear. The battle was only half over. While the 2nd Canadian Division fought in the Breskens pocket, the 3rd Canadian Division attacked Walcheren Island, the last German stronghold controlling the mouth of the Scheldt. Walcheren was a fortress. The Germans had fortified it with heavy coastal artillery, concrete bunkers, minefields, and garrison troops determined to hold. The island's sea walls protected it from invasion. Conventional assault seemed impossible. The solution was radical and controversial. The Allies bombed the sea walls, deliberately flooding Walcheren to reduce German defensive capabilities. The bombing succeeded in flooding the island, but it also condemned thousands of Dutch civilians to death by drowning and exposure. It destroyed homes, farms, and livelihoods. It turned Walcheren into an apocalyptic landscape where only the dikes remained above water, and the Germans held every dike. The Canadians had to assault fortified positions across flooded terrain yet again, but this time against even more formidable defenses. The Walcheren beaches were protected by the same type of fortifications that had bloodied the Allies at Normandy. Concrete bunkers housed artillery pieces and machine guns with interlocking fields of fire. Minefields covered every approach. The Germans had turned Walcheren into a death trap. On November 1, British commandos launched an amphibious assault on Walcheren's beaches while Canadian forces attacked across the causeway connecting the island to the mainland. The causeway was 40 yards wide, elevated above the flooded landscape, with no cover and no room to maneuver. German artillery had it pre-sighted. Attacking across it was suicide. The Calgary Highlanders tried first. They advanced in single file because the causeway was too narrow for anything else. German artillery and mortars turned the causeway into an inferno. Shells exploded every few seconds, throwing up geysers of concrete and earth. Men were blown off the causeway into the water below. Others simply disintegrated under direct hits. The Calgary Highlanders took 70% casualties in less than an hour. The attack failed. The next day they tried again. Different unit, same result. The causeway approach was impossible. Bodies from the previous assaults still littered the structure, making footing treacherous. German fire hadn't slackened at all. Every yard forward cost lives. The attack stalled after advancing barely 200 yards. Major Frederick Tilston of the Essex Scottish Regiment studied the situation and concluded that conventional tactics wouldn't work. The Germans had to be driven from their positions through close assault, regardless of casualties. On November 3, he led his company in a direct frontal assault across the causeway. Tilston went first, running through artillery fire that seemed impossible to survive. Shrapnel hit him multiple times, but he kept moving forward. His men followed, inspired by his courage or simply too terrified of looking cowardly to fall back. They reached the first German strongpoint and destroyed it with grenades. Then they moved to the next position, and the next, fighting at close quarters where German artillery couldn't target them without hitting their own troops. Tilston was hit again. And again. Blood soaked his uniform, but he refused evacuation. For 6 hours he led assault after assault against German fortifications, personally destroying multiple machine gun nests and bunkers. His company suffered over 50% casualties, but they broke through the German defenses and established a foothold on Walcheren. Tilston finally collapsed from blood loss after ensuring his men had secured the position. He survived and later received the Victoria Cross. The fighting on Walcheren continued for another week. Canadian and British forces cleared the island position by position, bunker by bunker. The Germans fought for every yard, making the Allies pay in blood for every inch of ground. German coastal artillery continued firing until Canadian infantry stormed the bunkers and killed the crews in hand-to-hand combat. On November 8, 1944, the last German positions on Walcheren surrendered. The Scheldt estuary was finally clear. Allied minesweepers began the dangerous work of clearing the waterway of the thousands of mines the Germans had planted. On November 28, the first Allied convoy reached Antwerp. The port began operations immediately, handling the massive quantities of supplies the Allied armies needed to continue their advance into Germany. The Battle of the Scheldt had lasted 38 days. The Canadians had suffered over 6,000 casualties, including over 1,300 dead. They had fought across terrain that military theorists considered impassable, against defenses that seemed impregnable, and they had won. Churchill read the casualty reports in silence. 6,000 men. Most of them younger than 25. Boys from Toronto and Montreal, from Saskatchewan farms and Nova Scotia fishing villages. Boys who would never go home, never marry, never have children, never live the lives they had dreamed about during the long nights in the mud and water. The Prime Minister had authorized operations that resulted in far higher casualties. The Battle of the Somme had produced 60,000 British casualties on the first day alone. Compared to the great slaughters of World War I, 6,000 seemed almost manageable. But the Scheldt was different somehow. The brutality of it. The sustained horror of fighting in freezing water under constant artillery fire. The way the Canadians had simply refused to quit despite casualties that would have broken other formations. Churchill visited the Canadian units after the battle. He wanted to see these men for himself, to understand what had driven them forward when every rational instinct screamed at them to retreat, to run, to save themselves. He walked among soldiers who still wore the mud of the Scheldt on their uniforms. He saw the exhaustion in their eyes, the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much death. He talked with them, asked them questions, listened to their stories. They spoke about friends who had died beside them. About wading through chest-deep water while machine guns fired overhead. About fighting in flooded cellars where you couldn't see the enemy until you were close enough to touch them. About the cold that never seemed to leave your bones. About lying in mud for hours, sometimes days, waiting for orders to attack positions you knew were probably going to kill you. One young corporal, barely old enough to shave, told Churchill about watching his entire section get wiped out in a single artillery barrage. 12 men he had trained with, fought beside for months, gone in an instant. The corporal had been knocked unconscious by the blast. When he came to, he was alone, surrounded by pieces of his friends. He gathered their identification tags, put them in his pocket, and walked back to his unit to report the section destroyed. Then he was assigned to a new section and ordered to attack the same position again the next day. Churchill asked him how he had found the courage to go back. The corporal looked confused by the question. He hadn't thought of it as courage. His friends were dead. Someone had to finish what they started. Someone had to make their deaths mean something. So he went back. Not because he was brave, but because that's what you did. You kept going until you couldn't go anymore or until the job was done. That conversation haunted Churchill for years. The casual acceptance of horror. The matter-of-fact way these young men spoke about experiences that would have broken most people. They weren't supermen. They weren't specially selected or trained for this nightmare. They were ordinary boys from ordinary backgrounds who had been asked to do something extraordinary, and they had simply done it. Churchill had seen the British Expeditionary Force at Ypres, had watched the Anzacs at Gallipoli, had witnessed the courage of RAF pilots during the Battle of Britain. He thought he understood courage. He thought he knew what humans were capable of when pushed to their limits. The Canadians at the Scheldt taught him that he had only scratched the surface. There's a particular kind of courage that comes not from individual heroics but from collective determination. The courage to keep advancing when you've watched your friends die. The courage to attack the same position you attacked yesterday, knowing yesterday's attack failed and cost dozens of lives. The courage to wade into freezing water toward machine guns that you can see waiting to kill you. That courage doesn't come from training or equipment or leadership, though those things help. It comes from something deeper, something that emerges when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances and simply refuse to break. The Canadians at the Scheldt embodied that courage. They didn't charge into battle with flags waving and bands playing. They slogged forward through mud and water and blood, one miserable yard at a time, because someone had to and it fell to them. They buried their friends and kept fighting. They endured conditions that should have destroyed their will to continue, and they continued anyway. Churchill returned to London changed by what he had witnessed. In his memoirs he would describe the Scheldt as one of the most important and costly battles of the war. In private conversations he went further. He told his military secretary that he had learned something about the capacity of human beings to endure suffering and still function, still fight, still accomplish their mission. The Canadians, he said, had done something that he would have thought impossible if he hadn't seen the evidence with his own eyes. The battle for the Scheldt Estuary doesn't hold the same place in popular memory as D-Day or the Battle of the Bulge. There are no famous photographs, no iconic moments captured on film. The fighting happened in obscure Dutch villages whose names most people can't pronounce. The conditions were so miserable, the fighting so brutal, that it defied the kind of dramatic narrative that captures public imagination. Men didn't charge machine guns across open beaches. They waded through freezing water and died in flooded cellars and drainage ditches. But the men who fought there knew what they had accomplished. They had broken through defenses that were supposed to be impregnable. They had fought across terrain that military planners considered impassable. They had sustained casualties that would have shattered most formations and kept fighting until the mission was complete. They had opened Antwerp and shortened the war by months, saving countless lives by ensuring the Allied armies had the supplies they needed to continue their advance. The cost was terrible. Over 6,000 Canadian casualties in 38 days. Entire companies wiped out. Battalions reduced to skeleton strength. Boys from every province of Canada buried in Dutch soil, thousands of miles from home. The survivors carried physical and psychological scars that would last the rest of their lives. Many never spoke about what they experienced in the flooded polders and on the Causeway to Walcheren. The memories were too painful, the loss too great. But they had won. Against all odds, despite all obstacles, they had won. Years later, a Canadian veteran was asked about the Scheldt. He was an old man by then, grandfather to a crowd of children who couldn't imagine the horrors he had witnessed. They asked him if he was proud of what he had done. He thought about the question for a long time before answering. Proud wasn't the right word, he said. Pride was for accomplishments that felt good, for achievements you wanted to celebrate. There was nothing about the Scheldt that felt good. Nothing to celebrate in the memories of friends drowning in freezing water, of boys burning to death in disabled vehicles, of the casual randomness of death that took the good and the bad, the brave and the frightened, without discrimination. But if his grandchildren were asking if he would do it again, knowing what he knew now about the cost, the answer was yes. Because it had to be done. Because if they hadn't done it, someone else would have had to, and the war would have dragged on and more people would have died. The math was brutal but simple. The old man's answer hung in the air, quiet but heavier than any speech or ceremony. His grandchildren stared at him, unsure how to respond, sensing that they had touched something sacred and immensely painful. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock, a sound eerily reminiscent of distant artillery to him. He took a slow breath, eyes distant, remembering faces he hadn't seen in nearly a lifetime. He thought of the mud. The endless, sucking mud that had claimed boots, rifles and men alike. He remembered the smell of diesel and blood, the sting of salt when seawater mixed with tears. He remembered boys who had laughed about home days before they vanished under the water, their laughter swallowed by the wind. He could still hear their voices sometimes, echoing faintly when he closed his eyes. What he missed most was the silence after the gunfire stopped. Not peace, the Scheldt never offered that, but the strange, haunting quiet that came after an attack. The fog would roll in from the North Sea, swallowing the landscape, turning the flooded fields into a ghost world. You could hear nothing but the slow drip of water from ruined helmets, the clinking of a dog tag in the wind, and the low murmur of prayers spoken too quietly for anyone but God to hear. He had looked around in those moments and known that he was still alive, by chance, by stubbornness, by some miracle. And alongside that knowledge came a guilt that he could never wash off, a question that haunted him every day afterward. Why him and not the others? The veteran leaned forward, studying the curious faces of his grandchildren. You don't celebrate something like that, he said softly. You remember it. Because forgetting would mean it happened for nothing. Churchill understood that truth too. When he spoke later of the Canadians at the Scheldt, it was not with the fiery rhetoric of victory or glory. His tone was quieter, reverent. To him, these men embodied a kind of courage that transcended the spectacle of battle, the courage of endurance, the courage to keep advancing when the ground itself seemed to reject your presence. He had seen it in their faces when he visited them after the battle, young and old, mud-stained, bone-tired, eyes hollow from nights without sleep. When Churchill shook their hands, he wasn't greeting soldiers. He was greeting survivors of something that defied human limits. Men who had seen the edge of what endurance meant and stepped beyond it. To command soldiers is to live with ghosts. Churchill carried many, but none haunted him like the ones buried in Dutch soil. He would speak privately of those days, long after the cameras and the speeches faded, his voice trembling slightly as he recalled the cost. They fought, he said once, not for empire or fame or medals, but for necessity. They fought because it had to be done. The Scheldt would never be as famous as Normandy or Arnhem. There were no grand beaches or airborne drops the public could romanticize. There was only cold water, mud and death. Yet within that misery existed a purity of purpose rarely seen in war. Every man knew exactly why he was there, to open Antwerp, to end the war faster, to save lives they would never meet. And though history often forgets their names, the evidence of their sacrifice endures. In Zeeland, Small villages still honor the Canadians every November. Farmers still plow fields where steel lies buried beneath the soil. Children still place maple leaves on gravestones, their red against the gray stone, a quiet promise that memory will survive where men did not. For the Dutch, liberation came from the lowest, most desperate places on earth, from mud, water, and young men who refused to stop. It wasn't just a military victory. It was human defiance turned into salvation. Years after the war, a Dutch woman from the village of Oostburg would recall how Canadian soldiers carried her brother through waist-deep water after he was wounded. She was 10. He was 16. A man from Montreal, she never learned his name, gave her his chocolate ration before disappearing into the fog. She never saw him again. But 50 years later, when Canadian veterans returned, she stood in the cold rain to thank them, tears mixing with the drizzle, and said, "You gave us back our lives." That was the Scheldt's legacy. A battle fought not for glory but for humanity. When Churchill returned to Britain, his staff noticed the change. He was older, somehow wearier than before. The victory should have been cause for celebration. The road to Germany now open, the end of the war within sight. But he understood that for every mile gained, someone had paid in blood. He wrote later that leadership in war is nothing without the will of ordinary soldiers. Technology, strategy, and logistics mean little when the human spirit collapses. At the Scheldt, he saw what happens when it does not. When ordinary men, cold, wet, terrified, decide to move forward anyway. It was a lesson not only in military resolve, but in the human condition itself. Courage is not absence of fear, it is the decision that something else matters more. The Canadians had proven that with every frozen step. Long after the flags came down, when Churchill's own health began to fail, friends recalled that he occasionally spoke the word Scheldt with a strange solemnity. No context. No explanation. Just the word, like a prayer or perhaps an apology. As though somewhere deep inside, the mud and the water and the ghosts of that place still called to him. Today, when you stand at the Canadian cemeteries in the Netherlands, the air feels different. The wind carries whispers, maybe from the sea, maybe from memory itself. You can almost hear voices in the distance, not in pain, not in triumph, but in endurance. The kind of silence that follows when duty has been fulfilled at an unbearable cost. The rows of graves stretch across the land they fought to free, boys from Halifax, Toronto, Winnipeg, Vancouver, Regina. Each stone marked with the maple leaf. Beneath every one lies a story unfinished. A letter never answered, a wedding that never happened, a dream buried under a foreign sky. And somewhere in that stillness, the spirit of the Scheldt endures. It lives in every soldier who fights because they must, in every human who chooses to stand when collapse seems inevitable. It endures because memory is the only victory time cannot erase. Churchill once said, "History will be kind to me for I intend to write it." But in this, history was kindest not to the man who wrote it, but to those who lived it. The Canadians who gave everything so that millions of others could one day live in peace. He had witnessed courage on every front. But at the Scheldt, Churchill saw something beyond courage. A quiet, relentless resolve that could not be broken. It humbled him. It changed him. And in that change lay one final, unspoken confession. He thought he knew war. Until he saw the Canadians at the Scheldt.